Much audio over here. So this is the series about Baltimore Jews and Judaism. And the more I'm writing this, as I go through lecture by lecture, I have to narrow the topic to Jews and Judaisms, because there's a whole bunch of things that happen in the Baltimore community, Jewish community, but we'll be here for 6 hours. And as it is, we've already been here for an hour and a half, right? Now, so first of all, I want to start by thanking the shul, as we always do. It's very nice when they do it. And tonight, as you can see, tonight this is being sponsored by the Friedmans, by Ira, Morris, and Kenny, in memory of the grandparents. So there's the daughter over there, who are part of the wave of Russian immigration to Baltimore over a century ago. Because by the time we're finished, I hope to get past the Germans to the Russian invasion, which goes from 1880, and that's when a lot of people came over. Right? The great majority of the Jewish community in Baltimore, I'll say it again, the great majority of the Jewish community in Baltimore came here between, let's say, 1880 and 1924. That's how it goes, all right? Now, if you can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll try to scream louder, but otherwise I'm going to assume you can hear what I'm saying. So let's get right into it. There was too much on the Germans last week to pack it into a single lecture, so I'll try to carry the story forward tonight and then get to the Russian invasion, which is in the 1880s. I left you off last time with a cliffhanger. It was the beginning of the Civil War, okay, 1860. And Baltimore, Maryland was a city of 200,000, and it was notorious as mob town. You don't know this probably, but Baltimore was the headquarters of the Know Nothing Party. And they, Know Nothing means they don't want any Irish immigration. Okay, that's the bottom line. Just like today people say they don't want Islamic immigration, you know, no Irish immigration. And they're against the Democratic Party, which then, like today, is in favor of more immigration. And there were big fights in the street all the time, and election days were very bloody in Baltimore, Maryland. It's very famous that in the 1857 mayor election, more people were killed on election day in Baltimore than in the Battle of Buena Vista, which was the biggest battle in the Mexican War, okay? You don't know, the Irish brought up a cannon and blew up the Protestant church, and then the Germans rushed with cleavers and did this and that and the other. So basically, if you were smart, you didn't go to vote. And here's the name of a guy who made the mistake of going to vote, and he was cooped. They locked him in a cellar, and he didn't recover. Edgar Allan Poe, that's how he died. You understand? Because they locked it in the cellar. They threw it in the cellar because they didn't think you want to vote the right way, and then they walked away. Okay? And the name of the blood tubs, you know, the execrables. I mean, they had like wild mobs over here. Okay? Now, in the midst of all these 200,000 people and all the fights going on are 10,000 Jews, right? That's what the Germans were, working hard to prosper. You know, either they just got off the boat or got off the boat a little while beforehand, and you start little and you hope to build yourself up little by little. Because remember what I said last time, it's no Social Security, no unemployment insurance, no nothing at that time. So if you didn't make any money, tough luck on you. And by the way, if you couldn't afford to pay a doctor, you didn't pay a doctor. You didn't go to the doctor, that's all. How'd you like that? So these Jews, some were Reform, some were Orthodox, and many in the middle. Okay? So at that time, we're talking about the German period. You have the 4 or 5 shuls that you have in Baltimore. You have the Baltimore Hebrew congregation. That's the Lloyd Street shul, as we call it today, where the museum is. You got your Fells Point congregation, which no longer exists, as you can imagine. That was a Reformed temple. Har Sinai had broken off from the Lloyd Street shul, and they made the Reformed temple over in West Baltimore. Then you have the Ob Shalom, which was sort of like in the middle, trying to be Reform and conservative and Orthodox all at the same time. You had the Minyan at Rabbi Rice's house, because I told you he resigned from the shul and just had a store on Howard Street. And what do you call it? Had a Minyan in the house. Okay? That's the real from. And then you had the Cohns and the Eddings. They had a Portuguese Minyan, okay, in their mansion. And they tried to make a go of it, and make a synagogue and all the rest of it. There weren't enough people their type. You understand? They wanted to make like the Spanish-Portuguese shul in New York and in Philadelphia and all that sort of thing. In fact, the president of shul was Solomon Carvalho. I don't know if you remember who that is. He was one of the big explorers with Fremont of the West. You understand? He wrote famous books of exploring Utah and Nevada and all those places back in that. He was a Shomer Shabbos, believe it or not. So anyway, the biggest of the synagogues is the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, which is comprised of factions struggling to define the shul their way. So the left-wingers want the shul to go this way, the right-wingers want the shul to go that way, and there are contentious board meetings and all this kind of stuff. And it was, and remember, new people are coming all the time because they're all getting off the boat, and many of them are joining the shul. And so the people you thought were voting, last time you wanted to vote 50 to 40, but now a whole bunch of new people showed up, and who knows what it's going to be. So you can imagine what the politics were. In 1859, just before the Civil War, the Frum element got power. They won the election in the shul, and they elected a Frum rabbi, a little bit different than Rabbi Rice, very interesting person. This is Rabbi Illoway, Rabbi Dr. Bernard Illoway. And he had a PhD. He was a Talmud Chassam Sofer. He was a big Talmud Chacham. He actually learned what we would say today, Haskalah Chachmat Yisrael with Shadal in Padua, if you know who that is. He was a very educated person, a very frum fellow, but he was already, as I would say today, more of a professional rabbi, and he, was better at the job. It was a better shidduch. Naturally, he's quarreling all the time. It's 1860 with the other guy who's a rabbi of the Harsonic congregation, and that's Einhorn, who's extreme left wing, wants to bring in more and more reforms. Okay. The reform movement, when it radicalizes, as it does later in the 1800s, it's by Einhorn's son and son-in-law, Kohler and all these guys. So they're fighting over Yiddishkeit, they're fighting over this, but the historians are only interested in the fights they have over slavery, because Baltimore in 1860, like the rest of America, no, more than the rest of America, was big fights in the city over slavery, over the slavery question. Herein lies the tale, because the slavery issue started out slow but got big. It started out cold and got hot. And Baltimore was a southern town. I told you last time, the rich Jews, the Eddings and the Cohns, they owned slaves. So did all those people lived in Charles Street and Saratoga, right? That befitted their class, you see. On the other hand, the German Jews who are showing up, and they have a store and they have a tiny little factory and all the rest of it, they don't have slaves. That doesn't fit the urban model. You understand? They want the free labor. Baltimore had a pretty big black population at that time, but most of them were free. Baltimore had the largest free black population in the country. And it's also true they had a lot of slaves over here, and a lot of slaves worked for themselves. It's a funny thing, like the mass, it's almost like in the Gemara, Asei mi v'eni zoncha, Maisi adach b'yadayach. You go and work and I get half of what you make or something like that. Frederick Douglass was a bought slave. His owner was on the Eastern Shore, and he lived in Baltimore, Maryland. He worked in the shipyards on his own, and he probably gave part of it to the master until he ran away. That's the famous story of Frederick Douglass. That's what Baltimore was. The Jews, like most people, didn't favor slavery, but they weren't opposed to it. In other words, they accepted it as part of the way it is. You understand? When they got off the boat, you understand? They immediately saw, especially you get off the boat in Baltimore, Maryland, or Charleston, it's the land of the free, the home of the brave, and they got slaves. That's the way it is, okay? Now, like most people in the mid-Atlantic region, the Jews yearned for a solution to the problem which did not involve disunion or civil war. Figure somewhere, because everybody said this is a bad system, it can't go, it's inhuman, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, people's whole economy in the South is based on this. The third largest economy in the world in 1860, the third largest economy in the world was Mississippi. It was England, it was America, and Mississippi. They made so much money on the cotton and all the rest of it. It was crazy, you see? So how you solve that, okay? Now, they weren't abolitionists. The abolitionists said, secede, break up the country. I don't know if you know that. The abolitionists already in the 1820s, they said, we favored disunion. Get it? The heck with the Constitution. That's Garrison Boulevard after William Lloyd Garrison. And John Brown, you know what he did? They said, this is such a terrible thing, the country should be destroyed over it. That's not what most people felt. They felt, figure some way out. How about a federal buyout? Just pay them. Free the slaves and pay the masters. That's what they did in England. That's what they did in Brazil. You know what I'm saying? Just put an end to it that way. It didn't happen because mainly the fire eaters in the South, in other words, the segregationist extremists, okay, and they were having nothing of that, including in Maryland. In other words, each side pushed to the extremes. The anti-slavery pushed to the abolitionists who said destroy the country. The other guy said, secede and form a slave country, and slavery is not a bit the evidence of Chatchila. You should read John C. Calhoun. Oh my goodness, slavery is the most wonderful thing that ever happened. They created a whole philosophy like that. You see, George Washington wasn't that way, and Thomas Jefferson wasn't that way. They said it's bad, we're just stuck with it. But later on, it evolved into this is great. And so, as you know, with these feelings, it led to the Civil War. I mean, we all know that, okay? Now, in the midst of all this came the election of 1860. Are you going to vote for Abraham Lincoln, or what are you going to do? The President of the United States, before the election, proclaimed a national tinus, a fast day, because America was a religious country, and everybody should go to their church, whatever it is, and pray for the future safety of America. And therefore, all the clergymen, including all the rabbis, gave big speeches on the question of the day, slavery. So Illoway gave a famous speech, or maybe a notorious speech, in which he said, you shouldn't break up the country over this. Figure some way out. Slavery is not in principle wrong, it's just the way it's being applied. After all, Avram Avinu had slaves. This is how he talked, right? Moshe Rabbeinu had slaves and things like that. It's not the same thing as they have in the South, but don't go crazy over it. Einhorn, the Reform rabbi, he was an abolitionist. He said, how can you say that? Right? You're torturing people. What kind of Bible are you coming from? And, oh my goodness, he really gave it to him. And the result is that both rabbis left town. Hold on for a second. Illoway, the Orthodox guy, he got an offer from New Orleans. Get it? He gave a justifying slavery, and they offered him triple the salary. So guess what? He took it. Okay? He went to New Orleans. Einhorn got out of Baltimore because they said that the KKK's come through. They didn't have that at that time, but the equivalent. They're going to go and kill you. And so he ran away to Philadelphia. You see? He tried to come back. And what it means is that there was no safe way of dealing with this. All right? When Rabbi Illoway left, which I don't blame him, when Rabbi Illoway left, that was the last chance, in my opinion, that the Baltimore Hebrew would stay frum, would stay Orthodox. Because he was kind of charismatic. When he moved to New Orleans, it's famous, they had no sukkahs, and when he left, they had 160 sukkahs. You understand? So he was able to be an influential type of person. But that's what happened. So what was the result? There's no rabbi. It's 1860. The election is upon you. It's fistfights in the shul. You can understand that. It's fistfights in the shul in Baltimore Hebrew. Therefore, the board of directors said like this, let's bring back Rabbi Rice. Why? He's too frum. He's not going to talk about slavery. He'll just cuss us out for not keeping Shabbos and not keeping kosher. That's better. We can handle that. You understand? It's better than talking about politics. You see? But Rice died in 1862, so it didn't last long. Too bad. After that, after 1862, the Baltimore Hebrew congregation slowly but surely will drift leftwards. Okay? But meanwhile, Baltimore is Baltimore. And Abraham Lincoln got elected. And the South went crazy and seceded. And Baltimore was the worst and most violent of all the cities because it's in the middle, half north and half south. I don't know if you know this, but Abraham Lincoln, on his way to inauguration, he traveled through the north and then he came through Baltimore. They were ready to kill him. It was a whole plot to kill him. It's very famous. There are movies about it and stuff like that. And he had to do like this. And I think most of you know what the Harbor Place is like down near Federal Hill. So and Camden Yards. So Baltimore was the place that you switched trains. In other words, all the trains from the north went as far south as Baltimore and stopped. And all the ones from the south went as far north as Baltimore and stopped. And in between is from, let's say, the edge of, let's say, President Street to Camden Yards. Right? What's that? Six blocks, 8 blocks, something like that. And so what you used to do is, this is the old days, they used to hook up if you're going south, like to Washington, D.C., which is south. Abraham Lincoln got to go to south. They detach the railroad car, they hook it up to horses, and they walk you down to Camden Yards, and then they hook it up to the train going south. That's how it was at that time. They're going to kill him when he switches the train, right? It's a good plot. So because of that, the Secret Service, whatever it was at that time, they said like this, come in 2 trains early. Instead of coming, you're supposed to come at 7 in the morning, come at 2 in the night. You understand? And they came in, were very quiet, they got in there, got on the train, and that's how he survived Baltimore. You understand? Now, his wife and kids came on the train at 7 o'clock. But this was America in the Victorian era. You don't harm women and children. You understand? Nowadays, it'd be different. But you don't harm women and children. Anyway, he got inaugurated, and within a short time, the South seceded, and Washington's in the South. And how are you going to get there? You got to go through Baltimore. They sent the Massachusetts troops to march through Baltimore to go south. And they were attacked by a big mob, and that's called the Baltimore riot, as you see over there, the shooting. In other words, they threw junk, all kind of stuff at the soldiers and killed a few. And the soldiers fired into the crowd. And it's mob town, okay? By the way, as you can see, there were Jews in the rioters. Jews are as stupid as everybody else. So some people, well, they are. And so some people are on this side, some people on that side, the ones who are real for the South, and Maryland should secede, and so on and so forth. And, they were in all that. So Abraham Lincoln, you can't hear the movie, but what do you call it? But the guy, that's Lincoln. Oh, you can hear it a little bit. Did you hear that? The mayor of Baltimore said, I cannot guarantee public safety if you don't let us secede. And Abraham Lincoln said, that'd be too bad, because then we'll have to burn Baltimore to the ground. Okay? And he meant it, because he can't survive with Washington cut off from the north. And what happened in the end, if you know a little Baltimore history, is they sent federal troops under General Butler in the middle of a rainstorm right to where Federal Hill is. They got off the boat, middle of the night. They marched up in the rain. You know all where Federal Hill is, correct? Downtown. They marched up that thing. They put a whole bunch of cannon around there. When Baltimore woke up in the morning, he's like this, you make a move, we blow this place up. And just to prove it, he shot one cannon, fell just short of the Washington statue, okay, the Washington Monument, on purpose. So he said, we can hit anything. And as a result, Baltimore from 1861, 1865 was under military occupation, martial law, and they could arrest you because Lincoln abolished the Constitution. You understand? The Supreme Court said you can't do it. He said, stop me. And turned Fort McHenry into a concentration camp. And there's many Jewish stories associated with that. I don't have the time to go into that. But if you said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing, somebody could just accuse you, and they just arrest you. They don't have to show a warrant. And they held you until 1865. You understand? And if you died because the jails at that time didn't have heating, heck with you. And that's what Baltimore was in the Civil War. And as I said before, there are many, let's go to the next one. There are many Jewish adventures in the war. Go to the one before that. Yeah. Here is the president of the show at that time. That was the frum guy, Friedenwald, Jonas Friedenwald. Does this work or not? Nothing's working tonight, right. What am I doing wrong? There we go. There you go. That's Jonas Friedenwald, and that's his son. This is Jonas and Aaron. Aaron was in medical school. He was becoming a famous eye doctor. Yeah, right. He was a famous eye doctor. And he actually founded, with Wilmer, the Wilmer Eye Clinic, And what do you call it? And he was a Shomer Shabbos. And he got arrested in the war because somebody said that he was disloyal, that they got him wrong with his brother. His brother was in Robert E. Lee's army, okay? And he just got married, and they arrested him on Friday night, and they put him in Fort McHenry, and goodbye, Charlie. And it was a whole big story, okay, how they eventually, and he almost died, and somebody got to somebody, somebody got to somebody, to Abraham Lincoln's foot doctor, who was a Jewish guy, Zachary, and, and I can't go into the whole story now. The long and the short of it is that the Lincoln replaced the military governor of Baltimore from Colonel Fish to a Jewish guy. It's Leopold Blumenberg. You ever heard of the 5th Regiment Army? He created the 5th Regiment, okay? He was a Union general who was wounded at Antietam and all this, and he was the president of the Hartsonic congregation, okay? And he got him out, okay? On a Shabbos, he said, like this, you go home and keep Shabbos for the rest of us, right? But if you didn't have pull, you're not going to survive the war. Talk to me about the cold and the TB and everything you're going to catch. So that's what happened with Baltimore in this time. On the other hand, I could spend all night talking about these stories, but I want to move ahead. Since I'm concentrating on Jews and Judaism, we'll skip all that. Rather, I would observe that in spite of everything I just said, the Jews in Baltimore made money during the war because this was a big industry town. For example, his brother-in-law, Weisenfeld, sold the boots for the Union Army, okay? Now, when the war was over, most of the German Jews were no longer struggling. Quite the opposite. From then on, increasing number of Baltimore Jews became part of what we call the Gilded Age, not the Golden Age, but the age of rich and corrupt capitalism. But in other words, if you made money, you lived high on the hog, okay? Because the U.S. economy expanded, and Baltimore exported clothes to the whole South. The Jews made this a big textile manufacturing and selling section, okay? In general, the German Jews moved after the war from running peddling baskets and push carts to becoming leading clothing manufacturers, department store magnates, and prosperous businessmen, mostly in the clothing, liquor, and tobacco business, not in the professions. You can't make any money as a doctor or lawyer. Real money you had to make in business. Let me put it this way. These Baltimore Jews rode the wave of the new technology of that era. It wasn't the computer, and it wasn't the railroad, but it was mass-produced, ready-to-wear clothing, especially suits, shoes, and hats. We're used to buying off the rack, right? It didn't exist once. Long ago, you went to a tailor or something, correct? Especially a lady, you went to a tailor. Who started this business of mass-produced hats and shoes? And this? The Jews, okay? And let's put it this way. This guy, Sonnenborn, he started little. He had 2,000 employees in Baltimore, Maryland, and he had the salesmen running all over the country. And throughout the South and the Midwest, what do you have in every town? A Jewish store. You do. If you have any experience in the old America, drive through the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and you'll see they no longer exist, but say Hoffman's this and Weinstein's that. And what were they selling 150 years ago? Clothes. And where are they buying the clothes? Baltimore, Maryland. And who's selling to them? The salesmen from the Baltimore companies who live in Baltimore. They're Jewish guys, German Jews, some religious, by the way, and there's your shoe route, and there's your hat route, and there's your ladies' dress route, and whatever. In other words, it's perfectly legal. There's nothing wrong with what I just said, right? You just got to be able to hit the road and put in the time. Can somebody give me a Kleenex or something over here? Yeah. So religiously, now, after the Civil War, this becomes the gold, thank you. Thank you. In the religious sense, excuse me. I'm always allergic to myself. They said religiously, this was the golden age of Reform Judaism in America. You understand? This is when it took off. Across America, Orthodox Judaism collapsed. All the synagogues, all across America, switched to, I'm talking about the German Schultz, switched to Reform Judaism between 1865 and 1890, which is remarkable. I mean, New York, Chicago, Midwest, the South, that's what happened. Obviously, Reform Judaism touched a nerve. It appealed to people, okay? You know, the decorous services, the shorter prayers, the more English, the music, the choirs, and the organs, and all that stuff, okay? And you feel much more comfortable inviting your non-Jewish business partner to attend services, and so on and so forth. And the Reform movement itself radicalized with the Pittsburgh platform in the 1880s, in which they say, we don't believe in this, we don't believe in that, we don't believe in anything. We're certainly against Zionism, we're certainly against peoplehood. We just are people of a religious denomination, but we're Americans, and so on and so forth. So notice the Reform movement itself, shrunk the sitter, let's put it that way, and people loved it. Baltimore, with about 15,000 mostly German Jews, became a bastion of Reform Judaism in the 19th century. A bastion, because you had the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, the Har Sinai, and the Ob Shalom, and they all ended up doing very well and building big temples, as you know. Let's go to the next one. That's the Baltimore Hebrew, when it moved to Bolton Hill. This is all, you move uptown, get it? From East Baltimore, you move uptown. Here is Ob Shalom, which was the richest of all the shuls, the wealthiest. And here's the old Har Sinai, which no longer exists. If you go there today, it's like a little park for F. Scott Fitzgerald, I think. Yeah. So, but let's put it this way. It's not the rinky-dinky things they had in East Baltimore. You had serious money over here, okay? And so they all moved into, this is Bolton Hill. That's what it is. That was the uptown, okay? And by the way, that was built along Paris lines, big boulevards. You know what Utah Place looks like and all the rest of it. It's very pretty, okay? It's very pretty. And the houses were mansions. For them, for these Jews, this was a golden age with their own gilded subculture. The German Jews developed their own country clubs, fashionable societies, social circles, and so forth. Debutante balls, by the way. Meaning, they weren't in the non-Jewish clubs, they had their own. They weren't in the non-Jewish, summer resorts, they had their own. It's just as rich, you see. These Jews really thought Reform Judaism was the most correct and enlightened form of Judaism, that it was unquestionably the wave of the future, and that sooner or later, even the Hasidim in Eastern Europe are going to go reform. That's that's how triumphalist Reform Judaism was in the late 19th century. As you can see, it's reflected in the styles over here. By the way, if you go there, and I've done trips, there's nothing Jewish on the outside, but Ob Shalom has Magen Davids and stuff on the outside. You see? So there was a difference between reform and reform. But nevertheless, whatever the case is, everybody did very well. And most significantly, to these Jews, and I don't blame them, their rise to prosperity and wealth after not that long of a time. We're talking about the 1880s, let's say, 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. They only got off the boat in the 1850s and the 40s, so it wasn't that long. Their wealth was sort of like, in a Calvinist sense, a confirmation. This is the derech hanechona b'yahadus. This is the right way of Judaism. It's an understandable point of view in the Gilded Age, okay? Everything we do is so classy. The Reformed service seemed so superior, so modern, so Western, so progressive. On the other hand, the Orthodox service was seen as so backwards and so déclassé. You understand? If you belong to Orthodox, it's a low class, which is the worst thing you can say in the Gilded Age, okay? Now, Baltimore was not unique in this, just a little more intense, okay? What was unique about Baltimore during this period was the survival of Orthodoxy among some German Jews, a minority, okay? This did not happen elsewhere. So you're not going to find around the country, at least to my knowledge, that German Jews will form distinctly, I'll call it frum shuls, in the post-Civil War period. It always goes the other way. Was this due to the legacy of Rabbi Rice? Maybe, to some extent. He had inspired, when he was alive, two sets of Baltimore Jews, A and B. One was his mispalim, the people who daven in his house. And number two, his fans, who nevertheless remained behind in the Baltimore Hebrew congregation to try to fight to keep it Orthodox. That was like the Friedenwald family that I showed you before. They didn't join his minyan. They stayed in the Baltimore Hebrew and to fight the fight, okay? over the course, and there's a difference between the two. How should I put it? The ones who were from the house minyan were more strictly Orthodox and firmer. And the ones over here were very, very traditionalist, and Shabbos and Kashrus, mikvah I don't know about, but, the basic things that we would call Orthodox Judaism, but they were all unlearned. There was only even a Torah going over here. Over the course of time, neither of these two groups, one's going to be the Chizuk Amun and one's going to be the Sheretz Israel, neither of these groups developed anything in terms of chinuch, and therefore the whole thing proved episodic. In other words, this orthodoxy in the two synagogues lasted a generation or two, and then it switched. Okay? If you ask about the Sheretz Israel, that's a different story. We'll talk about it. These two sets of German Jews opened, after the Civil War, two German Orthodox synagogues, one somewhat more to the right of the other, as I said. The first was the Chizuk Amunah. That's the story of Friedenwald, as I said before, when it was a young man in his older age, and they built this shul. In other words, the synagogue was called the Baltimore Hebrew Congregation. It was the old Lloyd Street shul, which is now a museum. They had fights over there all through the 1860s, should it go to the left or the right. Late in the 1860s, they went to the left. They had membership meetings, and they said they're going to have an organ, they're going to take out the mechitza, they're going to go the whole 9 yards. And it's about 25%, I would say, really felt bad about this, and they took it to court, okay? And they're going to fight it in court. But it got so ugly, and so they said after a while, this is stupid. Just make your own. And so it was a guy, Rosenwald and Friedenwald and so forth, and they just said, okay, we're going to make our own synagogue, which they call Chizuk Amunah, strengthening the faith. Get it? And took them a couple years to get, about 25 people. It took them a couple years to get their financial act together. And very Jewish style, they built a shul right next door to the old one, and higher. Okay? So if you go today to Lloyd Street, what do you see? You see the old synagogue, which is a museum, and you see the other one, which is now the rest of the shul, and it's bigger and fancier, which is, okay? But it didn't matter because the Reform Temple moved a few years later. The Chizuk Amunah got an interesting rabbi, but kept him on a short leash. Therefore, his period in the rabbinate was disappointing. They got Rabbi Dr. Henry Schneeberger, who was the first American-born rabbi, and certainly Orthodox rabbi. Born in New York, he went to Columbia University, and then he went to Europe, and he went to study in Germany and in Hungary for a while. Hildesheimer had a yeshiva at that time before he had the seminary. And I'm not going to call him the biggest Talmid Chacham ever walked down the road, but he was sincerely from, and he's American, so he can speak English. So he can give sermons in German and in English. That's what they wanted, you see? And they kept on a short leash. And just because somebody's from or observant doesn't mean they're not going to be little tyrants and chairman of the board, all the rest of it. And they were pretty rough on him, and that's how, and they kept him, the shul, stayed what they wanted to be, which is not too from, but Shomer Shabbos for sure. And I want to tell you something. The first generation was very sincere when they had the opening day of the synagogue, and I think many of us have been downtown to the Russian shul, and they've redone it, the Associated rebuilt it, and so forth, and it's impressive. People didn't want to sit on the cushions on the chairs because how do you know it's not shotness? You understand? So they were a religious group, you understand? But they didn't know much. And anyhow, what can I tell you? It was more like, I would say, a kind of an open orthodoxy, because in order to join the shul, you did not have to be a Shomer Shabbos. You simply had to want the shul to have Orthodox services. And they wrote in the Constitution, if anybody brings up to change the service, they forfeit their membership. So that the form and that the shul should stay correct, that's the main thing. Should have an Orthodox sitter, should have a ladies' balcony, you should have a bimah, and all that matters. You understand? No female choirs and all that kind of stuff. But not like everybody should go to Daf Yomi or something of that nature. So in other words, let's put it this way. There were a fair number in the membership already in the beginning of traditionalists. That is to say, people, you go to shul, there really used to be a lot of people like this. You go to shul, it's a frum service, At home, you turn on the lights, you watch TV, and this and that and the other. And that's what we had already at that time, 1870s, 1880s. So in other words, an Orthodox service with a number of members, which over the course of decades later became a majority, who weren't really Shomer Shabbos. But I'll say it again, the heart was in the right place. The Friedenwalds, for example, which was the ruling family, and they had half the shul was Friedenwalds, and they gave half the money. You understand? So they were horrified by either extreme. Too reform, terrible. Too frum, also terrible. You understand? And that's what it is. This pattern, which we today call modern Orthodox, well, no, we wouldn't call that today modern Orthodox. It's what you called in Baltimore a couple generations ago modern Orthodox. You see? This pattern would expand in Baltimore across the Eastern European Jews in the 20th century, not the 21st, okay, as we shall see. Then it would collapse in the later part of the 20th century. So when it was an experiment that failed long term, but 120 years is a long run, okay? Then there was the other set of German Jews who went Orthodox. These were the two minions that used to daven with Rabbi Rice, and then formed two separate minions. In other words, they all davened in one minion, and then when he died, some were in this place and some were in that place, and eventually they joined together, and they united in 1879 in West Baltimore, I say, not East Baltimore, and that's Sheretz Israel, okay? This was the frummest in the German community, because they had a rule, you can't be a member if you're not Shomer Shabbos. Now, nobody's going and peeking in your house, okay? So, I don't know about that, but you can't have a business open or anything like that. And that's what it was. And they wanted to adhere to the old ways. And and the first rule they said is no rabbi. And the reason is because every shul that took a rabbi, the rabbi went to the left. That's how it was in the 1800s. Even people who came over from Germany and from very, quote unquote, from backgrounds, when they came over here, they drank the water and they went nuts. And therefore, they were too frum to have a rabbi, okay? It wasn't for 15 years that they finally took the plunge. So I'll just tell you who it was. When we run it our way, we know how it's going to run, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't know if you have a shiloh, I don't know what they did, but this is how they ran it, okay? Now, these two synagogues were not looked down upon by the Reform, because they were German Jews too. They were fellow members of the tribe. They were adhering to old German Judaism, which was respectable. Notice even somebody in the Baltimore Hebrew or the Yoav Shalom can understand that, okay? I think many of us have had relatives or somewhere along the line. They weren't necessarily observant, but they respected the fact that you are. You understand? There still was enough. Everybody's parents and grandparents in the old country had been observant, so they respected that. And they weren't poor. They weren't rich, but they weren't poor. So that's the main thing. Now, I would say they were part of the cousinhood, as they call it, meaning they're all related. And where is it over here? She's Marsha Rosenblatt, one of my professors. She has a long article about this. Listen to this, just to give you an idea. Because all the German Jews was a big club, you understand? And they intermarried Henrietta, the daughter of Henry Sonnenborn, who was a leading manufacturer, head of Ob Shalom, married Hutzler's son, who was in Har Sinai. Sonnenborn's nephew, Rudolph, became a protege of Aaron Friedman and Chizek Amunah. So one went this way, one went that way. That Rudolph Sonnenborn helped Ben Gurion later on form the Haganah, if you know. It's a famous book from the Pledge or the Promise or something like that. And that's because he was very, very traditional, you understand? Harry Friedenwald shared a lifelong friendship with Henrietta Zold, even though her father was the rabbi of Ob Shalom, and his family were the big machers in the Chizek Amunah. He married Bertie Stein, the daughter of Samuel Stein, who was the president of the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, and so on and so forth. And not only that, members of one congregation, even officers and trustees, also belonged to other synagogues. So some members of Ob Shalom paid dues to Chizek Amunah and other congregations. Henry Sonnenborn was a member of Ob Shalom and the biggest donor there, but he retained his membership in Baltimore Hebrew in the 1860s, and he was a member of Chizek Amunah at the turn of the century. So how does somebody be a member of, why not? It's a free country. You understand? In other words, they respected each other, even though they didn't necessarily go to the same services on Saturday. You understand? Similarly, various members of the Heck family, the Heck department store, belonged to both synagogues, meaning Chizuk Emunah and Baltimore Hebrew. Silas Fleischer was an active member in Ov Shalom and Chizuk Emunah, and Julius Schloss, who is the son of the president of Ov Shalom, belonged to Sheretz Israel. Okay? And many members, this is how it went. I'm just trying to show you that what happened then is not what happens later on in the 20th century in Baltimore, where the two communities get divorced. Okay? Because today we're all divorced. The Sheretz Israel eventually gets a neo-Orthodox rabbi, by which I mean like a German Orthodox, like a graduate of Hildesheimer Seminary with a PhD, Rabbi Dr. Shepsel Schaffer, who really was a Litvish, he's from Kurland, but he was from a more Western type. And anyway, he went to Berlin, and he got a secular education. He got a doctorate. And by the way, if you got a doctorate in Hungary, that's like getting a doctorate in Tijuana. You understand? If you got the standards were very low. If you got a doctorate in Germany, that's already was demanding. So that's how it went in those days. Anyhow, but listen, what do they call the guy who graduated last in Tijuana? Doctor. Same thing at that time. But this guy was the real thing. And by the way, he married, when he came to the shul, a month later he got married, to the daughter of one of the biggest Gedolim in Lithuania, Alexander Moshe Lapidus. It was the right-hand man of Israel Salanter. So now their children, didn't stay religious. Anyhow, Schaffer is famous because he became a big Zionist. He went to the first Zionist convention. They used to say he's the only one from America. There were two, but but still, now that's very interesting. Why would you be a Zionist, a political Zionist? You don't want the Jews coming to Baltimore in such waves. They should make a Jewish state in Israel. He says so. Make a Jewish state in Israel, let them all go there. You understand? But whatever. Now, he was a frum guy. By 1880, this is how the Jewish community had crystallized by 1880. Two shuls in Baltimore strongly Reform, two strongly Orthodox, one in the middle, not really. That was the Ov Shalom, whose rabbi was Benjamin Sold, the father of Henrietta Zold, who is always saying you should keep Shabbos, you should keep kashrus, but the siddur that he produced cut out like 3/4 of the siddur and all the beliefs in Tchias HaMesim and all the rest of it. Everyone was very comfortable with the situation. After all, prosperity was growing. Baltimore was kind of a business capital of the South. All those Jew stores that I told you all over the South, that's what it used to be. And who's supplying them? Life was perfect, basically. They had made it. And then everything changed. Then comes the Freedmans, okay? Then everything changed. Because then comes the Russian invasion. Okay, you see? Up till 1880, it was just great. We're all the same, and everybody's doing well, and Gamarnu. And now comes a horde of poor people. The Russian invasion, which tripled the population in Baltimore, leaving the Germans as a minority in the Baltimore Jewish community. In other words, the world turned upside down. Okay? Herein lies the tale. There were a small number of Eastern European Jews in Baltimore already before the Civil War, in the 1850s and 60s. There was a small shul or two downtown. One was called Bikur Cholam. That was for the Polish Jews. And the other one was called B'nai Israel. When they broke away, made for the Russian Jews. Meaning, some are Polish and Russian means Litvaks. You get it? So, you know how it goes. Oil and water. Okay? Oil and water. And then B'nai Israel for the Rosh. As you know, the B'nai Israel is still the name of the shul downtown on Lloyd Street because they bought, later on, the Chizuk Emunah building, when the Chizuk Emunah up. Okay? So that's why, if you go downtown, this is the old Bikur Cholim, which is on High Street. And then the B'nai Israel is still there. Okay? It's still there. It's a functioning synagogue. Back then, before the 1880s, these Eastern European Jews in Baltimore, which are called Russian, Eastern Europe called Russia, right? These Russians were inferior to the German Jews because they're less wealthy. They had small grocery stores and push carts and that kind of thing. By then, the German Jews had moved past that for the most part, or their children sure had, and they had department stores and big businesses and, that. Plus, the German Jews had come from a Western country, Germany, and they spoke German, which is the second language of cultured Baltimore. I told you there was a ton of German non-Jews in Baltimore way back when, a ton, and the street signs in this city were in English and German. That's famous. And in a lot of places around the country. There were a lot of German clubs and societies, Turnverein and things like that. The Eastern European Jews, on the other hand, spoke Yiddish, totally unknown here. And they appeared more unkempt and less cultured, less Americanized. Everything about them was not American, you see? And I'm talking about before 1881. And then comes the wave, you see? After 1881 and the assassination of the Tsar, because what happened was, let's go to the next thing over here. This is the Alexander II was the Tsar of Russia was going through St. Petersburg in 1881, and a terrorist group blew him up. Right? I think you can sort of see. Left him in the snow. Is that it? Yeah, that's it. He made the mistake of going. A bomb went off. It missed him. He went out to see what's going on. Then he threw another bomb at him. Okay? That's him. He's okay. And right? 1 second. And the girl throws the bomb. He said, "Why do you want to kill me?" 1 second. Right. And C throws the bomb that kills him. Now I'm showing you this for a reason. Blew him up. She was Jewish. That's the point. The whole group was not Jewish. She was Jewish. She's the one who did it. So therefore, I forget, she had a Jewish name, Kaplan or something like that. No, I'm serious. That's all you need to get rid of all the pogroms. You understand? All the pogroms. You didn't do it. You didn't do it. Yes, you did. The Jews killed him. And so the result was, let's put it this way, 2 million Jews come to this country, almost 2 million Jews, over the next 40 years. That starts the wave, okay? All over the country, in every region, but mostly in cities and urban centers, because that's where Jews go. So look what happened to New York, Jewish-wise. Look what it did, 20-fold. You understand that? The Jewish community in New York, in 40 years, grew 20 times. You see? And by the way, the wrong kind of Jews, not German Jews, and not Western Jews, all these Russian, Eastern European, Polish, Galicianers, God help us, the Hungarians, the Romanians, the wrong kind of Jews, you see? And by the way, Baltimore is a port city. You don't got to go to Ellis Island. You get off here and you can stay, you understand? So, what was the attitude of the Russian government? Here's the Tsar they killed, that's the guy they blew up. There's his son who said, "I'm going to get the Jews." There's the prime minister or the interior minister, and he said to the Jews, "Please leave. The door to the west is always open. You don't like it here? Good. Go somewhere else. Please leave." In other words, it wasn't like the communists where they wouldn't let you out and you had to refuse next. Gay. Right? The German Jews see buckets of Jews getting off the boat all the time. Must you come? So many of you? We don't want anti-Semitism in America, says Jacob Schiff. You know what I'm saying? We, German Jews, have it worked out now. We look like everybody else. We pull our own weight. We make money. We fit in. You understand? You guys, not good. And on the other hand, what about Jewish solidarity? This was the number one German Jew, Simon Wolf. He was the Jewish lobbyist in Washington. And he said, we got to go by Chaverim Kol Yisrael, Kol Yisrael Areim Zel Lezeh. Even though he wasn't religious at all or anything like that, it's got nothing to do with it. And he lobbied the federal government, I can't go into details, to get all kind of special dispensations or whatever, and it made it work. And that's why they got over here, because of him. Okay? And even in Baltimore, Maryland, they had a big meeting to figure out how to keep the Russian Jews out. And wait a second, the president of the Ob Shalom, he got up and he said like this, all I know is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Echad. We can't do this. Can't kick them out. We got to support them. You understand? They're flesh or flesh, blood. I don't say I'm crazy about them coming or anything like this, but we do have a responsibility towards, and I can't hear this business that they're the wrong kind of Jew. Right? Now maybe because his son was in the Sheretz Israel, I don't know, but whatever the case is. Baltimore now became a city with 2 Jewries, though this should not be exaggerated. In this series, I'm concentrating on Judaisms and not on the ethnic divisions which were present. If you want to have a great insight into the ethnic divisions between the German Jews and the Russian Jews, you read this novel, written in 1917 by Sidney Lauer Nyberg, who was a big lawyer in Baltimore from a German Jewish family, in the Baltimore Hebrew, and he was a well-known guy once. And he wrote these novels for a side, and one is all about, it takes place. It's really a wonderful novel with the German community and how they deal with the Russians. And the rabbi there tries to do social work, but he can't speak Yiddish. So the Jews say you're not really Jewish. It's a whole big business. A very interesting book. Probably costs $2 online. By the 1880s and 1890s, classical Reform Judaism had crystallized, as I told you, theologically radicalizing in the process. And it was the Judaism of most of the German Jews who were now rich. This was Judaically manifested in the big temples, right? In other words, by the 1890s, they went all the way. Ob Shalom used to be 50-50, but then they didn't fire, but they retired Rabbi Zold, who was only 62. And they said, we want another guy, and they got a reform rabbi, and the first thing they do was switch the siddur, and switch this, and switch that. And now you have, the classical reform that some of us remember. No yarmulkes, organs, mixed choirs. You want the closest thing you'll get to the Mormon tabernacle choir. You have the good old Union prayer book, which is about that skinny, the original one. No Hanukkah or Purim, right? Because those are nationalist holidays. What are you celebrating on Hanukkah? Think about it. You understand? And Purim, what? Because she hurt the Gentiles? You don't want to celebrate that. You want ham, and you want shellfish at the Kiddush. Not that you're not mocking, you dafka want it, and all that business. Strongly anti-Zionist. Oh my goodness, the classical reform in its heyday. Zionism is like a dirty word. When the British issued the Balfour Declaration, and the League of Nations says that Palestine can go for the Jews, all the shuls in Baltimore, the Har Sinai, the Ob Shalom, the Baltimore Hebrew, and so forth, they all issue a protest. You understand? And we have nothing to do with this sort of thing. So everything was going great. And now comes a horde of Yiddish-speaking Jews from Poland and Galicia and Lithuania. These Jews look at the temples and they say, what kind of a shul is this? You understand? What kind of a shul is this? And it becomes pretty clear that Reform Judaism is not going to really be a universal religion. You understand? I'm not even sure they want it to be. You see? So the triumphalist feelings that were there up to the 1880 or so are now, what's the right word? Smell the coffee. You understand? Because most of the Jews in America are going to be of a different type. East Baltimore, and to a degree West Baltimore, now have, in the 1880s and 90s, German Jews, East European non-Jews, East European Jews. And the Jews are moving in more and more all the time. We're going to crowd the non-Jews out for the most part. So what happens to the Lloyd Street Shul? I mean the museum. It was the Baltimore Hebrew. And then it went Reform. And then they moved uptown and built that fancy synagogue on Madison Avenue. And they sold it to a Catholic church, a Lithuanian Catholic church, because that's who moved into East Baltimore in the 1870s when they moved. But a few years later comes a wave of East European Jews, and there's a famous story, I don't know if it's true, that Dr. Friedenwald had a dream, and he said, the shul where you were bar mitzvah is now a church, And so he got together with and they bought the shul back. You understand? Notice they purchased it from the Lithuanian Catholic Church, and it became a synagogue again. It became the most ultra-Orthodox synagogue, the Shomer Mishmeres, Rabbi Schwartz, from long ago. So it went through three identities, you understand? It was the Baltimore Hebrew, and then it was a Catholic church, and then it became the Shomer Mishmeres for 50 years. And now it's a museum, of course. It's a museum because they were so religious, they didn't want to sell it for a church. And they put in a clause, which is still there, that can only be a museum, you can't have any religious services there. You see? Because chas v'chalil, you might have the wrong one. So, but that shows you what am I talking about? The demographic, the residence patterns. The neighbors came and went and came and went. But meanwhile, in East Baltimore, dozens of minions and shuls pop up in the 40 years between 1880 and 1920. All right? I mean, every group that gets off from Schnippeshik starts a Schnippeshik shul. You understand? And the Chernogiver and this one and all the rest, and the Kolker shul and dozens of them. Okay? Baltimore is transformed because if you've been following these lectures till now, it wasn't that kind of a city. Okay? And now it becomes like, so to speak, the Lower East Side. And there were lots of shuls here. What can I tell you? And the shul fills, the city fills up with Yiddish speakers, and many of them are quite religious from the old country. It's a new reality. On the other hand, not all the Jews that came over from Eastern Europe were religious. Plenty of non-from, but non-from in the Eastern European style, which skipped Reform Judaism and went straight to secular. Because Reform Judaism never really hit Eastern Europe, very little, and only for richy riches. And as the 1800s went by, after you dropped being religious, you simply went to being secular. After all, Karl Marx and Charles Darwin and Buckle and others have proved that, God doesn't exist and the Bible is made up. So why you waste your time with Reform? Why would you do that? Just go straight. This is an important phenomenon in Jewish history, and it certainly manifested itself in Baltimore. So let us stell on this for a moment and start with the background very quickly. As I said many times, old traditionalism consisted of fundamentalism, antinomianism, and autonomous coercive communities and cultural insularity back in the old country. Fundamentalism means you really believe in God, you believe the Torah is telling you the truth. Nomianism is you're obsessed with halachas, with rituals. Which shoe did you tie on first, right? Can you open a can on Shabbos, right? Autonomous coercive communities mean you had a kehillah, and they enforce discipline in the members. And cultural insularity means cultural insularity. You want to keep talking Yiddish, you see? But then the Jews of the world, of the West, got hit in the 1800s with modernity, including emancipation, urbanization, which led to everybody going to public schools, idealistic German philosophy, which showed you that nomianism is stupid, historicism that showed you fundamentalism is stupid, and these destroyed the four pillars of traditionalism among many, okay? The result was the rise in the 1800s of something that never existed before, which was, and let's go to the next one, non-fundamentalist religious Judaism, that's Reform and conservative. In other words, you want to be religious, but you don't exactly believe in the Torah Sinai and all that sort of thing. You don't believe in God in an old-fashioned way. And number two, secular Judaism, which never existed. Secular Judaism could be negative or positive. Most Jews today in Baltimore, unfortunately, are secular Judaism negative, meaning, in Baltimore, They're just Jewish. They don't do anything. They don't bother with a Seder. Now, they didn't convert. And let's say, out of the luck of the dice, she's Jewish and he's Jewish. The two Jews married each other. But that's all it is. They don't do anything. You know that. And number two, and by the way, some of them could be socialist, in which case you embrace a radical form of non-Jewish secular Judaism. You understand? In other words, how to express your Judaism through socialism. On the other hand, you also had positive secular Judaism, the Haskalah, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, which would be the academic study of Judaism, Zionism, Yiddishism, even Bundism. Each one of these isms is arguing for a secular. Notice, they don't believe in God. It's a secular, but you want to be Jewish. And you want to express your way not by putting on talis and tefillin, you want to express your way through these forms, the Haskalah and the Wissenschaft and the Zionism, all the rest of it. These positive secularisms only popped up in the Eastern European communities in places like Baltimore. The German Jews were Philistines. They're not interested in culture. They are interested in making money. And by the way, the Reform Temple works very nicely for them. You understand? The country club works very nicely for them. And they just like all the other Americans, everybody in America belongs to a church, which doesn't get too much in their way. That's what they got over here. Why should they want to go for all this radical junk, all right? And why should they want to cultivate a Haskalah and Hebrew literature and things like that? They can't read Hebrew at all, and they're not interested in reading Hebrew. So this hit the Russian Jews. It didn't hit the German Jews, who are successful in terms of American culture and aren't interested. They're not interested in serious Jewish culture. Zero interested in Ivrit. And anyway, don't be too Jewish. That's one of the 10 commandments of the German Jews. Don't be too Jewish, okay? Now, on the other hand, at that time, they didn't marry out. All these 500, 600, whatever 100 German Jewish families, they all married each other. I mean, for the most part. The Eastern European Jews are a different story. They're going to bring now Eastern European Rabbanim, though there were many fakers. They got off the boat and said, I'm a rabbi. And, I think I told you last week about what happened in Galveston. Has anybody know who's really a rabbi? And by the way, I got off the boat. I'm a rabbi, and I'm giving a hechsher to 10 butcher shops. You understand? I saw in there was a big case in Baltimore, a very ugly case in the Baltimore Sun in 1897. He claimed to give a hechsher in the thing, but the other two rabbis said he's a faker, it's not kosher, and they took it to court. And the judge is saying, what's the Shulchan Aruch? All that business. It was a real mess, okay? This was the golden age of Yiddish. The golden age was Yiddish was widely spoken in Baltimore in America, because that's the only language they knew. And so if you went to East Baltimore at that time, unlike when the German Jews were there, now you got signs, newspapers, books, theaters. They had a Yiddish theater here. An entire subculture. Now, that's not unique. The Italians did it. The Greeks did it. Everybody does that when they get off the boat. But if we're talking about Baltimore, if you ever see a picture of the old downtown, you see Hebrew letters or Yiddish letters, it's from this period because of this group, okay? Now, these Eastern European Jews will create, in the next 40 years and after, two new Jewish cultures that didn't exist here. One is religious, but Nusach Eastern Europe, not German, right? They'll create a big Eastern European Jewish religion, Lithuanian, Polish, Russian, Hungarian, and so forth. And a secular one, because there'll be plenty of Jews that move into Eastern Baltimore, and they're, like I said before, they're socialists, they're this, they're that, complete atheists, and they like it that way. Then they might talk Yiddish, and they might be interested in reading Yiddish newspaper, but don't confuse that with being religious, okay? When I was a kid, I remember if my father dropped the Yiddish newspaper, you're supposed to kiss it when you pick it up. It's crazy, right? We had the Morgan Journal, not the Forward. The Forward, you spit on it, but what do you call it? But it was a different type of culture that they're bringing over here. So, what's the religious? Shomer Shabbos, to the degree you can. Now, everybody knows how hard it was to be Shomer Shabbos because they made you work on Saturday. The public schools were open on Saturday till then. The Jews are the ones, in state by state, that fought like hell in the early 1900s and 1910s and that kind of thing, to make it that there's no school on Saturday. You don't know that, but I do, okay? Now, they couldn't get rid of Christmas carols and pageants. They tried that, didn't work. But that they made that you get off on Saturday, but not at the factory and not at the workplace. You understand what I'm saying? Not at the workplace. And so this is the way it was. You had Shomer Shabbos. You had a lot of traditionalist Jews over here. I knew many, and you knew many. They worked on Saturday. They had kosher food. They bought a kosher butcher, let's put it that way. Forget about mikveh and taras mishpacha, but they had a lot. They bench licht, you see? But as with the German Jews, in this 40-year period I'm talking about, there was no successful chinuch. And by the time they arrived, it's the golden age of American public schools. Free and efficient. Once upon a time, the public schools worked. And you learned, and if you didn't learn, they beat the heck out of you. And you know what the immigrants are like? If you go home and tell them that they beat the heck out of you, what happens? Parents beat you. The teacher was right, and they beat you double. You understand? That's what it was. So let's put it this way. You got a pretty good education, K through 12, in the public schools. You did. If you're interested in basic, sound secular education. And you can go to college after that. So let's put it this way. How are you going to have a day school? I'm not going to pay for that. Right? What was the state of chinuch over here? Right, the chaters? Oy vey. You understand? The synagogue schools, like the Germans did, the modeling on the Christian Sunday schools. You know what that's worth? The Talmud Torah was a new idea. That was supposed to be, you take it out of the synagogue, you make for the community, and it's supposed to be more professional and all the rest of it. Theoretically, Talmud Torahs might have worked, especially 100 years ago. In other words, let's just pretend for a second that you would have had, in 1890, a TA in Beis Yaakov, meaning, listen to what I'm saying, you go to public school in the morning, you finish about 1 or 2 o'clock, and then you go in the afternoon to a real Beis Yaakov, to a real TA, and you have 3-4 hours every day of real studies. And don't tell me it has to be in the morning. When I was in TA, I don't know what it is now. When I was in TA, they had so many kids that, for some classes the Hebrew was in the morning, and some classes the Hebrew was in the afternoon. Maybe Beis Yaakov was like that, I don't know. But you could have done it, and if it would be from, and to be efficient, it could have worked. But it didn't happen that way, because Jewish education, especially at this time, was taken over by cultural Zionism, okay? This is what happened in America in the early decade of 1900. Cultural Zionism was more or less created by Achad Ha'am over in Europe. It's the Haskalah, tricked out in more modern form. The way it came over to America was through these two guys. This is Mordechai Kaplan, okay, he made the Reconstruction, but that's later in his life. Mainly, he was involved in influencing the development of Jewish education. In other words, the Talmud Torah schools. And this is the guy who started the first one, Samson Benderly, who started in Baltimore, Maryland. He's from Eretz Yisrael. He was actually a doctor, but he came to this country, he met Dr. Friedenwald. And actually, Friedenwald brought him here. And he said, make a real efficient Talmud Torah school where you have, let's put it this way, the kids come and get milk and cookies, and then they have real trained teachers, and they have something called classrooms, and they have, assemblies, and they have textbooks, and it's in a clean room and all the rest of it. And this took over the country. But basically, it was not from. I mean, that's the point, okay? So on the one hand, they did establish an organized school system, which the Frum couldn't do. They were like at 6s and 7s. They're just terrible at that. With all the chitzonius, like I said before, you get a dedicated building, you get a fire escape. This is not in somebody's cheder in the backyard, you understand? And it was important, but it utterly failed in the panemius. You get it? Now I'm looking from our point today, but that's what history is. You get to look from your perspective today at dead people, right? It didn't work because there was the education itself was devoid of any kind of spirituality. You understand? On purpose. So basically, this movement was like Napoleon, who said, I found the crown in the gutter and I picked it up and put it on my head. You understand? Well, let me put it this way. It's really, really the fault of the Frum, if you want to get down to it. You see? They didn't get their act together. And you can't blame people for saying, if I want my son, my daughter to get some kind of a Jewish education, which won't be a complete and total turnoff, I'll send them to the Talmud Torah. And Baltimore had several of them, okay? And they all came from the same chevra, and they went to the Teachers College in the Jewish Theological Seminary, which Mordecai Kaplan set up at the time of Solomon Schechter. And some of them had degrees from Columbia Teaching School. So as you have the professional things, the teacher comes in with a roll book, it's a Kiddush, with a curriculum, you understand? It's there. But the subject matter wasn't there. The result was a chinuch which was devoid of fundamentalism and nomianism. In other words, it was incredibly anemic and ultimately unsuccessful. It was successful for the teachers because it provided all these guys with a salary. Okay? And I had a number of relatives like this. Benderly, as I told you before, started in Baltimore, but Jacob Schiff brought him to New York, and he said, I like your system, because he didn't want anything too frum, and I like the fact that it's clean and organized, and neat. It looks like a geisha school, and therefore I'll bankroll it. He gave $50,000 to start a teacher's college in Jewish Theological Seminary. $50,000 at that time, I'm talking 1903. That was money, okay? This is a prime example of what I talked about in the positive secular Judaism developed by the Eastern European Jews over here at the turn of the century. I said secular Judaism. That's an oxymoron. Judaism is a religion. Is it Judaism? Well, it's not religious. It was the American version of cultural Zionism, okay? I'll talk about it more next time because it really takes off after 1920. But it will not fare too well in this country because a major part of this was Ivrit be'Ivrit. And as Solomon Schechter himself said, America is the graveyard of languages. Well, right? Raise your hand, unless you're a certain age. Raise your hand if you can speak Yiddish. I don't believe it. Okay? Okay, as I say, I'll repeat the second phrase. Let me put it this way. Can your kids speak Yiddish? You know what I'm saying? That's the graveyard of languages. By the way, that's not a good thing. It's sad. Okay? Because a lot of things you can only say in Yiddish, you can't say in other languages. It's sad. I grew up speaking Yiddish, but my kids forget about it. You understand? Meanwhile, East Baltimore, I should say, presented contrasts. On the one hand, it was a flourishing shtetl. You had shuls everywhere. You had minions everywhere. You have Jewish, non-from Jewish societies everywhere. On the other hand, it was a slum. And it was a slum for the easiest reason. The blockbusters of that era bought large homes, and tell me what they did. They bought the German Jewish homes, because the Germans moved uptown. You subdivided it. You made it into small apartments, moved in 1 million immigrants. That creates overcrowding. Deplorable health conditions. Everybody had TB in those days. It's terrible, okay? And together with the poverty, the overcrowding damaged the integrity of the family unit. Now, we think of this usually as being associated with African-American population. Happened to the Jews, okay? It always does. Kids grow up on the street at all hours of the day and night because your apartment's too little, too small. So what do you see all around you? They don't see the shuls. They see vice and vice and vice and crime and crime and crime. Because everywhere that there was a shul on the same block is a brothel and that sort of thing. That's what it was. Listen, that's what it was, okay? And so, the best of times, the worst of times. It was a slum, okay? Some kids, understandably, want a quick buck. And as we usually know, those kind of people, those kids end up, bad or dead, or both, right? As happens today. So you had your share, I'm not going to name any names, but we remember plenty of people like that. Right? The only real way out, you and I know, is through education or real business. So every kid growing up in East Baltimore in the 1890s or 1900s, 1910s, the question is, which way are you heading in life, buddy? Right? Which way are you heading in life? Because and you know how it goes. You have 5 kids in the family. One ends up a rabbi. One ends up in jail. Right? She ends up like this. This one ends up like that. And that one ends up a doctor. Because they had different roads and each one picked a different path. And unfortunately, all those paths were there. You see, all those paths were there. The German Jews did their best to try to help. They set up 100 different committees to aid immigrants. I mean, I give them credit. You know, they had the clothing society and this. Friedenwald's, I should care. Friedenwald's daughter, old man Friedenwald, Jonas Friedenwald, who came in 1830, he had a bunch of sons and one daughter, Betsy. And she married a rich guy, Weissenfeld. They made money. And then her husband died. She was very charitable. When she came to Baltimore, they were poor as church mice, they had no shoes. You understand? You know, and when they landed on the boat in 1830, so now that she's rich, she was in charge of the shoes. Well, a shoe society. No Jewish person in East Baltimore should go barefoot. Don't laugh about that, because if you went to the Italians and the other places, it was what it was. Now talk to me about winter. Talk to me about stepping on nails. You understand? So that was her charity. Another lady got something with, with the dresses. And someone else for orphanage. And someone else, they had sewing society. I don't know what they did. The sewing society, I guess they made clothes. There's and I'm talking about the Har Sinai, the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, the Ob Shalom, the Chizim, they did good things. Question is, can private charity cover these sorts of businesses? The uptown ladies raised money, and they do all kind of what I call Lillian Wall things, go down to the bad neighborhoods and try to reform the kids, all the rest of that. That doesn't work, okay? But they meant well, okay? This is what you call top-down charity, trickle down. This was the origin of the associated. That's what I'm talking about. Because out of these different groups, when they'll amalgamate, they say, why should I have a sewing group and a shoe group and and a chicken soup society and a this society and that society? Let's try to amalgamate them. See, because it's the businessmen, German Jews. You try to consolidate, you understand? It started uptown, and it couldn't help but being patronizing, but who cares? Help is help. You understand? Listen, they made, what do you call it? Scholarship funds. So if you want to get to Hopkins or someplace like that, you can't afford it. If you got the right grades and all the rest of it, they'll pay for scholarship. I mean, they did good things, okay? But you know how it goes. I don't want to always be on the receiving end. After a couple of years, the Eastern Jews, when they're on their feet, they set up their own self-help societies, right? And so, but you have in Yiddish 100 of these types of societies. So that's East Baltimore. There are two sets of charities, uptown and downtown. You get it? One was called this and one was called that. Eventually, in the around 1910 or so, they joined together. They don't join together. They don't amalgamate. They associate. That's what's called the associated. Baltimore is the only one like that. Everywhere it's called federation. Here it's called associated because associated means like this. We're not losing our identity. And the Germans say, okay, okay. And this is the American form of the kehillah, right? Now, meaning you can't have a real kehillah with everybody elects a board of directors. It's not in America. The most you can do is what I always call the faux community. That's what American Jewry developed. Meaning, look, here's a JCC. If you want, you can use it, but get a membership. You don't have to use it, right? Here's a family services. If you want, you can use it. Chances are people will use the JCC. Chances are people will use the family services. People will use this and that and the other. You understand? So then, since you're using us, we're the community, right? Of course, we get to say how the priority should go, obviously. The Kehillah idea, therefore, in America, in Baltimore specifically, but all across America, will be distinctly secularized and very American. I mean, in a religiously divided Jewish community, the answer is you have to have no religion at all. You get it? In other words, if you're going to have Sinai Hospital, it can't be Orthodox, it can't be Reform, it's nothing. You see? That's the way it worked out in Baltimore, Maryland. De facto, the Orthodox are on the out because they don't contribute all the money, right? Although in Baltimore, which had a very traditionalist strain, the Sinai and Levendale will have kosher food from day one, if you want it, okay? That's not kosher, but if you want it. That's better than a lot of other communities in the United States of America. If you went back 100 years ago, in a lot of communities, you went to an old age home or any of this kind of stuff, and no kosher food available. Hospitals, forget about it. So within the context of American Jewish communities, Baltimore a little more traditional. I would say that the German Jews had a little more feeling for this. In other words, me, myself, and I eat a ham sandwich, but I understand that you don't. Okay? Jewish-wise, synagogues flourished. There were minyanim and shurim, but nobody young. Okay? The immigrants get off the boat. They belong to the shul. They belong to the chevra. She belongs to the noble ladies or something like that. Not her daughter, and certainly not the grandchildren. What was the solution from the frum point of view? Should you go the Talmud Torah route, which Rabbi Dr. Bernard Drachman, again, who was highly educated in New York, he said that we can make it work. A Talmud Torah system, everybody goes to public school in the morning, and you have a very good Talmud Torah in the afternoon. Listen, the first Beis Yaakov in Williamsburg was afternoon. So in 1942, 43, Rebbetzin Kaplan, I think, right? I mean, they didn't have a school. You did what you can, and it worked. By the way, that would mean your tuition bill would be cut in half, right? Maybe you want to make a Hildesheimer Seminary in Baltimore. That was the plan of Rabbi Schaffer. He actually founded a Jewish theological, a rabbinical, Orthodox rabbinical seminary in Baltimore, Maryland. It didn't go anywhere. By the way, that would have been a different Baltimore also, because just like in Berlin, watch this. 7 years in the Yeshiva Seminary, 7 years in Hopkins. You come out with a PhD from Hopkins and a smicha from the seminary. That'd be a different type of rabbinate. You see? Didn't get off the ground. You want to make a yeshiva like Rabbi Rice does when he becomes a rabbi, the Shemer Shmeris? What happened? None of the above. Not in the years 1880, 1920s. That did not happen. So East European Orthodoxy in Baltimore remained a one-generation affair for the most part. And anyway, everyone was concentrating on getting up from poverty. You see? I scratched the surface tonight. The perfect exam is good, so let's call it good night. We'll daven Marv in a minute or two.